One moment here. Thank you, Jillian, for the warm welcome. MBNA is proud to be CCAE's national sponsor and celebrating our 20th year as national sponsor. I'm excited to introduce our host and special guest for this afternoon's discussion. For today's discussion, I would first like to introduce Derek Cassoff. Derek is Managing Director of Communications for McGill's Office of University Advancement, where he oversees a team of writers, editors, graphic designers, project managers, and digital strategists. His communication teams have won several awards for their work in both national and international competitions and played a lead role in providing a full range of marketing strategies and materials that were instrumental in helping Made by McGill, the university's newly launched brand platform, as well as its associated $2 billion fundraising campaign. Derek has been on the CCA board since 2016 and will serve as the organization's board chair for the next 2 years. He has also served as commissioner on the CASE Commission for Communications and Marketing. Accompanying Derek today is our special guest speaker, the Right Honourable David Johnston, with Canada's 28th Governor General. During his mandate, he established the Rideau Hall Foundation, a registered charity that supports and amplifies the Office of the Governor General in its work to connect, honor, and inspire Canadians. Prior to his installation as Governor General, Mr. Johnston was a professor of law for 45 years and served as the president of the University of Waterloo for 2 terms and the principal of McGill University for 3 terms. He has authored and co-authored more than 30 books. He was named Companion of Order of Canada in 1997. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Cassoff and the Honourable Mr. David Johnston. Derek, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Rob, for that introduction. I hope everybody can see me and hear me. Great to see you again, David, if only through Zoom. I still fondly recall the 2 times you came back to McGill's campus in 2019. The first was in February when you traveled in from Ottawa during a giant blizzard to join us as we celebrated the $200 million gift from John and Marcy McCall McBain to launch the McCall McBain scholarships at McGill. And then of course, we welcomed you back to campus again in September for the 50th anniversary of the Leacock Lunch, which was part of our festivities marking the launch of Made by McGill, our $2 billion fundraising campaign. So I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the entire McGill community and especially our fundraisers when I say that we cannot wait for this pandemic to pass so that we can welcome you back to campus again. So before we jump into our conversation today, I'm wondering how you're doing and how you're weathering the COVID-19 pandemic. I understand you're hunkered down somewhere outside of Ottawa, surrounded by some of your loved ones.
Thanks very much, Derek. I presume you can hear me all right? The audio working? Good.
Yeah.
Yes, we're very fortunate, Derek. We live in a farm about 40 kilometers west of Ottawa, the center of Ottawa. My wife and I bike in on the Trans-Canada Trail to the center from time to time, but we've had 5 of our grandchildren, 14 of them in total, 5 of them with us at our farm for the better part of 6 or 7 weeks as they've been doing their schoolwork from online and so on. And we've had just a terrific time. The 2 of them are 12-year-old twins, and the parents are both doctors in the Ottawa hospital. So we've been kind of in parentis with them, and the parents come out at 6:30 at night and they walk the 185 acres with us 2 meters apart, and then we gather for dinner in the screened-in porch, and we've got all the grandchildren around the table, and the 2 dogs have to sequester off in the corner. We've done well, and when you're so fortunate dealing with something like this in the wonderful circumstances we've had, you think of the many people across the country who are really living in very challenging circumstances at the present time. I should also say how wonderful that you reminded us of the 2 recent revisits to McGill. I should tell you, Derek, I still get shivers up and down my spine when I come in through the Rodick gates. I love that great institution, and it's been so important to higher education for such a long time.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I'm glad to know that you guys are doing well and that you managed to take the time to join us today for this conversation. So let's get into it. So we're coming up on nearly 3 months now since the pandemic arrived in North America, and our educational institutions, not to mention our entire lives, have been completely upended in ways that no one could have ever imagined. And yet we've seen some incredible responses to the pandemic from our universities and colleges and schools in Canada. Are you at all surprised by how quickly Canada's educational institutions were quick in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic? And what does it say about the leadership of Canadian schools with respect to handling crises of this magnitude?
Doesn't surprise me at all, Derek. But before we get into that, let me say how delighted I was to join the conference for those wonderful statements by Carissa and Jenna as TD Malash-Minox Insurance Fellows. And, you know, it reminds us from small acorns, great oaks grow. We had the privilege at McGill back in the middle 1980s of being a pilot project for the McConnell Foundation to develop young professionals in advancement. And I think we had 3 fellows in the first year that Michael Kiefer and Tom Thompson and some great McGill people looked after. And it was the beginning of a program really to develop a new cadre of young professionals in advancement. And it's just terrific to see how far it's come and how far has we come with the notion with the advancement professionals. And if we have time, I'll comment a little bit more on what professionalism means in any pursuit, but it begins with integrity. With respect to the response of the higher education system, I'm not at all surprised. We expect our system to be responsive. Certainly the national leadership has been very strong, and the initiatives at the local level, particular institutions, has been very, very heartwarming, each appropriate to its own circumstances, but they range across the challenges of closing schools and residences and so on, dealing with international students from abroad, our own students abroad. It involves safety, of course, of all of our people, staff, students, faculty, etc. Moving in a more accelerated pace to online and multimedia teaching and learning, a little bit overdue in my judgment, but what a wonderful kickstart we've had to move into that modern era and get the best of both in-classroom instruction, work experience, and digital instruction as we come out of this pandemic. Wonderful to see how applied research has responded so well, not simply in the immediate scientific fields, but led by them. 2 of our children I mentioned are doctors, they're clinical physicians, so they see patients for a day and a half a week and then do research. So when they leave us here at the farm to go back home, they've been up till 2 or 3 in the morning for a period of 2 or 3 weeks with research grants. I think in the case of one, our son-in-law, who's an emergency room pediatrician, I think he and his colleagues were responsible for, I think, 5 new grants developing responses to the pandemic, not simply the particular virus or care issues, but the broader issues of public health. And the other child is our daughter, who's a family physician who develops measured outcomes. And of course, that work comes into great relief. So it's been wonderful for us to see in our family how individuals have been responded. But, you know, we see things like student emergency funds and gearing up in a variety of ways. And I'll just finish by saying I have the privilege of chairing the Rideau Hall Foundation. We run the Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program, which over the past 4 years has been responsible for over 3,000 students from Canada going abroad or international students coming here. Over about $120 million invested in that. And I chair the advisory committee for the Universities Canada and Colleges Canada on the Outward Bound Mobility Program that the Government of Canada has instituted. And I've written to each of the leaders of those programs across the country, just congratulating them on how well they've done. And then equally, at the urging of Paul Davidson, a letter to each of the Canadian university presidents on the response to the pandemic. And it's been wonderful to see the engagement and the responses, to see our sector doing so well in challenging circumstances.
Great, thank you. So not to suggest that you've been around the block a bit, but how have schools dealt with past crises, such as wars, major economic recessions, or similar global health emergencies in the past? And have these past responses prepared us any better for the crisis we're currently living with?
Well, let me just refer to McGill because you're doing the interviewing, Derek, and responses there. I think 1, you expect resilience, 2, you expect innovation, and 3, you expect leadership. And that leadership has to do with both talent and knowledge to a particular challenge. In World War I, I think almost all of us would be familiar with In Flanders Fields, the poem that John McCrae wrote in the trenches of World War I with the terrible casualties and carnages that were occurring. He died shortly after that particular poem of pneumonia in the ranks. He was a young medical professor at McGill when World War I broke out. Sir William Osler, who was then there as one of the famous physicians, said he was really the sparkling person in his class, and had he survived the war, would have come back to Canada to do great things. But he, in fact, was part of the McGill Medical Corps, very quickly establishing a cadre of physicians and nurses and health workers who were there on the front lines. Just one example of what we saw across the country. World War II, what I think about specifically was immediately after the war, we started the Veterans Program, but that was initiated about 1943 when Cyril James was then principal of McGill, and he engaged with C.D. Howe, who was the Minister of War, and the Mackenzie King Cabinet, said we have to prepare our veterans for life after, and out of that came the Veterans Program across Canada to enroll veterans returning from the war in higher education programs. A wonderful success, and done with the most imaginative and kind of jerry-built systems, picking up barracks where they could find them. McGill established Dawson College at a former military base, and that's where the instruction took place for a year or so. Those are just examples of how well our higher education institutions responded to the crisis, as you'd expect with good leadership and good people. I'll just finish by saying, you know, I spent my whole life in universities, Derek, and for me, I often say the cause and the company are very good. The cause is so idealistic. Knowledge and development of talent as really important objectives in a society. And then the company, how blessed we are to deal every day with the people we do in our institutions, our students, our staff, our faculty, our alumni supporters, and all of those people who care greatly about education.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I'm already starting to feel optimistic about what the post-pandemic world will look like if we can look at some of those historical lessons for sure. I'd like to talk for a moment about the role of philanthropy and community generosity in contributing to the responses that we've seen at our institutions. So I'm going to refer to your op-ed piece that you published in the Globe and Mail on May 5th. In it, you talked about the importance of the Giving Tuesday Now call to action and how it created a unique moment of unity that harnessed the power and potential of generosity and propelled us toward hope and healing. Why do you think Canadian alumni and other donors have been so willing to support the efforts of their alma maters at a time when many of us are feeling the financial pinch of job losses and economic uncertainty? And what would your advice be to schools who might still be on the fence about whether this is in fact the right time to proceed with fundraising asks?
The answer to the first question is because it's so important. And the answer to the second question is listen, engage with those who care about the university and determine what it is that they think we should do as the best response. One of the few positive elements that comes out of a pandemic like this is it causes us to pause and reflect on the really important things in life. What are the important initiatives? What are the important institutions? And then typically, as we think about that, we rearrange our priorities a little bit. For me, education is such a fundamental priority, especially for a society like Canada, that's built on the proposition that we can have equality of opportunity and excellence too, as mutually reinforcing values. And that by providing the opportunity for every person in our country, every young person in particular, to develop their talents to the fullest. And guess what happens? That limitation expands and expands as your talents develop. You develop a cadre, a basin, a system of educated people who are prepared to put their education to good use. And the second thing that is important is we realize that when we look back on this beginning of the 21st century, I think we will see that sovereignty has a new definition, and sovereignty will be more largely defined not by the size of your GDP or the military that you can amass, etc., but by the degree to which a particular society provides opportunity for all of its people to develop their talents, and then cherishes education and knowledge as a very optimistic approach to the new challenges ahead and uses that knowledge for the promotion of good. And so I think that's why we've seen a strong response by folks in Canada to our higher education institutions. And I think the best way we go after that is with the integrity of the professionals that are part of the advancement teams and all of the members of our institutions to do a lot of listening and caring about where the real needs are and how we as institutions respond in new ways to life after this pandemic, which will be somewhat different than before.
So maybe I'll just refer back to that second part of the question about institutions on the fence. You mentioned Tom Thompson earlier in our conversation. Tom obviously had a very distinguished career at McGill, and I remember once telling me that the number one reason people do not support a particular cause is because they're not asked to. So if you were at a university now and you, in terms of, if there was any hesitancy about whether this really is the right time to go to the community for support, why again would you say that this is really, how would you sort of fashion that ask, and why would you do it now?
Well, I think there's a lot of preamble to the ask, Derek. What we all do, and I regard myself as an advancement officer like you, although not nearly as professional as you and your colleagues, we establish relationships, we reinforce friendships of people who've had the privilege of attending Canada's universities, which are really high quality, accessible, and for the most part affordable, really have had a privilege. And I think most of us realize that. But I think what one does is one attempts to engage with those privileged people, beginning with when they were students and then following all the way through, so that that one is not asking into a vacuum, but one is responding to a relationship, a set of conversations, and saying, here's a new need. It seems to me, given our past association, it's one that you can respond to. I would also say you have to keep your sense of humor. I had the privilege of attending Harvard as an undergraduate and was on scholarship, and I guess pretty early on said job number one for me is to repay when I graduate at least the amount of funds that was invested in me as a scholarship. So we had a class gift, as many good institutions do, and we had 4 class marshals elected and then class agents that looked after our alumni connections over the years. And one year I got a call from the VP Advancement saying, we're starting another major campaign for Harvard, and we want to do a little pilot project in Alaska and Canada. We'd like to be able to establish a pretty high percentage of participation in those alumni so that when we go to California and New York and Florida, of course, we'll be able to say we've had 50% or 60% response. So I said, sure, I'm happy to do it. And I think we had 26 people in the cadre of the particular classes. And I had 3 months, and I initially wrote letters and followed up with a phone call, and then, as necessary, followed up with a little bit more. And as of 12 hours before the deadline, we had 25 of 26 who donated. And there was a fellow in British Columbia that had never answered my letters or my phone calls or my telegrams. But one last shot, I called him about 8 o'clock at night on the last evening, and to my delight, he answered the phone. And I made my spiel, and he said, you're such an idiot. He said, I've had your telephone calls, I've had your emails or your telegrams, I've had your letters, and I've turned them down. And the only reason I picked up the phone now, I thought it was my girlfriend calling. But he said, I hated that place. He said, I only went there because my father and grandfather had, and they said, I only get the trust funds on my 25th birthday and having had to complete my education and not having had another drink. And he said that 25th year comes up in about a month, and I'll be a free man. But I will not give a penny back to that institution. And if you put in $10 in my name, I'll sue you and the university. You'll be very embarrassed. So I thought that kind of stopped me pretty quickly. But I said, well, we got 12 more hours. And if you change your mind, I still will put the $10 in if you put the $10 in. And that was the end of the call. So the moral of that long story is, of course, ask and be prepared from time to time that you'll run into roadblocks and humor stories, and just keep your sense of humor.
Great. And I'm afraid to ask whatever happened to the girlfriend he was expecting to call from. But, so maybe there's a good opportunity to jump into this question you sort of referenced earlier about the professionalism of advancement teams. I mean, all of us are kind of on this Zoom call now working in various facets of advancement. So what is your take? You've obviously been a principal at two different institutions in this country. What has been your sort of relationship with the advancement teams, and what value do you find that they bring to the institutions they serve?
Well, I'd quote Shakespeare, and I say, clasp them to your heart with hoops of gold or hoops of steel. They're remarkably important people. In fact, if I were starting a university tomorrow, Derek, number one, it would involve work experience education. I'm a great believer in cooperative education, work and theory going hand in hand. But my first appointment would probably be the director of alumni affairs and advancement. And people say to me, "You're pulling my leg. Why would you appoint a director of alumni affairs when you don't have any students?" And indeed, you know, it takes 3 or 4 or 5 years to graduate them, and another 20 or 30 years before they're in a position of affluence, if they're lucky, where they can do something for the institution. I said, well, you really have to start very early. You have to start even before the student appears at your door as a potential alumni, and you work on that relationship all the way through. And in fact, it doesn't end when the student graduates with a degree. That graduate should look upon his or her institution as the first place to go to for continuous education and so on, a whole area that I think is not fully developed in our institutions. And that's a very professional set of activities, the notion of how you engage a community that is part of you but then leaves you, and the community beyond who may not have attended your institution but know it's important in the particular community, in the province, and in the nation. And professionalism for me is integrity, that word that is so fundamental and is often taken for granted. Classically, a profession is defined as having 3 particular elements. One is it has a specific body of knowledge, which itself is largely responsible for generating and renewing and innovating. Calls on other disciplines as well, but that profession sees itself as having special skills. The second thing it has is the responsibility for entrance, exit, and competence. Now, in the case of advancement professionals, it's not like law where you turf people out when they're fraudulent with their clients, etc. But it does involve a very careful monitoring of ethics and performance and competence all the way through. And the third element is a public trust. It's a social contract. Our society gives to professionals a certain degree of respect and indeed even responsibility for the advancement of that profession in return that trust is fully met, that it isn't breached, that it doesn't slip into bad habits, that it does continue the ongoing innovation in the knowledge, the skill sets, and the ongoing development of young people, as we saw with the consequence of the McConnell Fellows coming into the TD Meloche Knox Fellows that we celebrated today. And that's why I think we who are advancement professionals really have a special stewardship role for those most precious institutions in our society, those institutions that have to do with the development of talent and advancement of knowledge. I'll just go one further on that, Derek. I know we're running out of time, but I don't think we've ever seen in history a time when the importance of our institutions of knowledge has been more apparent and more critical. We as teachers, you know, for centuries, apart from folks like Plato, Socrates, and so on, were kind of the fountains of knowledge, and students would come to us and we'd lecture them and they'd take down their notes and away they'd go, hopefully improved. That's all gone. Data is so much more readily available than it is in a lecture. It's just all over the world. And the challenge, of course, is to move from data to information to knowledge, and with any luck to wisdom. And so educators are now involved in the process of developing the critical thinking more than anything else, not the amassment of knowledge. And it's a very privileged position, but it's also a very exciting one, because what we've learned about the human brain in the last 20, 25 years with imaging is equivalent to what we've learned about it in the last 2,000 years. All of a sudden, we've learned so much more about how people learn and how we can help them to learn better. we've also learned how much more innovation and innovation for good is important to us, and to shape our societies, that we, first of all, extend that knowledge, develop our talent base, and then try through interaction with different nations and managing conflict, that knowledge is used for purposeful good outcomes and not to destroy ourselves in one way or another.
Great. Thank you for that. So we only have a couple more minutes of your time. So let me end on this question. So it does strike me that one silver lining that might emerge from this pandemic is that it has served as a reminder and perhaps even a wake-up call to all Canadians about the critical role that science, education, and the transmission of knowledge must play in any modern functioning society. So I'm curious to get your take on how should educational institutions leverage this particular moment in order to ensure that we emerge from this crisis having fully restored an understanding of the importance and value that universities, colleges, and schools bring to our societies.
Well, I go back to a wonderful short essay that Stephen Toop wrote when he was just finishing his term as chair of Universities of Canada. And Stephen is now the vice chancellor of Cambridge University, a very challenging position for any person, and particularly as the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. His essay was to the universities, "I love you, now please change." Interesting little contrast. I love the universities and have been so fortunate to spend virtually almost all my life there, and I'd still be there if I were called to do a government job a few years ago. But we must be sure that, like good professionals, we are constantly innovating not only the knowledge in our own spheres, but the knowledge institutionally as to how we manage these institutions. And I think the pandemic has been, as I mentioned earlier, a bit of a wake-up call for us to move more into the digital age, know that life will be different when we restore our campuses to in-residence learning and so on, and to take advantage of that as a kind of kickstart to be more innovative in how we conduct ourselves and our work. I would also say that I think it's important that Canada recognizes its important role in the world as a country that is looked to with admiration for our educational system. It's not perfect, but I think if you see those views of equality of opportunity and excellence too, we probably work harder at it than almost any society on earth. And we must continue to do that, to identify the gaps, and to see ourselves really, without being arrogant, as the Athens to the new Romes that are emerging, some kind of in erratic ways that give us real pause and concern and worry, some in more attractive ways. But we really should be a society that says we begin by understanding our responsibilities to grow all of our talent with opportunity, and then be quite relentless in holding ourselves to a pretty high standard of excellence and making that available to the world community and not simply to ourselves.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that answer and for your time today, David. I know we are just about out of time for this conversation, but on behalf of the entire CCAE membership from coast to coast to coast, I'd like to extend my best wishes for good health to you and to your wife, Sharon, and to your extended family, and our deepest gratitude for you, to you for having taken the time out of your schedule today to share with us such great insight and lessons from a career that has been dedicated to public service and the advancement of education in Canada. So thank you so much for that.
Derek, it's great to be with kindred souls today. Take care and keep well.
Great. Next time in person. And it's now my pleasure to turn things back over to Gillian Morrison for that moment you have all been waiting for, the official start of the CCAE Annual General Meeting. Gillian?
Thanks, Derek, and thank you for moderating that conversation. You did a superb job. And Mr. Johnston, on behalf of all of us attending today and the entire education sector in Canada, profound thanks for sharing your insights with us and for your service to Canada over your long and storied career. I was really looking forward to your remarks today because I knew that your deep experience in education and philanthropy would offer us all encouragement and insights into how to maintain momentum, and most of all, avenues for continuing to have an impact as we collectively pursue the important missions of our institutions. I know that we'll all leave the call today with renewed energy, a bit more optimism, and a renewed commitment that will help us all to persevere as we move through this the impacts of the pandemic and into the recovery effort. So 1,000 thanks for being with us today. I know you've all lifted our spirits and given us so much to think about and pathways for moving forward. Thank you very much. Thanks also to you. Thank you, sir. Thanks also to you, Derek, for moderating the conversation. You did a great job. And I want to say also a very special thanks to Rob Volpato and the entire MBNA team for their continued support of CCAE as a national partner. As Rob reminded us, MBNA has been with CCAE for over 20 years, and it's been an outstanding partnership, and we look forward to the next 20 years together.